Here's what I want to try and get at, I think. How much of approaching music in this way, listening to music in this way is like automatically pleasant, and how much of it is like active study that you're willing self into because it will make for a better life?
Hmm. That's it's a good question.
Here,
I think it depends on what we're listening at. For me, at least, I won't speak for Evan. We'll hear what he has to say as well. But I think it depends on what we're listening to at any given time. Some things being total diamonds in the rough, underappreciated type of stuff. I mean, the things that leap to mind first for me with regard to that idea are like some of the early Bob records that we covered, during the first run of Jokermen, Street Legal, Shot of Love, stuff like that we've talked about endlessly at this point, but records that I think are legit 3-star classics, to use our parlance, and are just like completely misunderstood by folks out there. Not every record is like that by any means, but even those that aren't, I think it still yields a more rewarding kind of relationship with the music when you approach something like, let's say, Fallen Angels by Bob Dylan, or Mistrial by Lou Reed, or Hobo Sapiens by John Cale. When you approach those records that maybe aren't actual stone cold classics waiting to be rediscovered, but approach them with that same kind of generous mindset, I'm going to try to find a way to appreciate whatever we're listening to, whether or not I think it's like actually something that is, worth appreciating to the extent that I do, your Blonde on Blondes, your Blood on the Tracks, is your Pet Sounds, and so on.
It started, I think, with actually a very undefined notion of what was going to happen when we committed to this hyper completionist mode. That was just kind of the concept at the very beginning, I think, was just there's all this stuff everybody says is good at the beginning, in which we all know is good.
right.
Just like imagine you could turn off the part of your brain that knew any of the received wisdom, and you were just like, oh boy, I just found out there's more records by this artist I love. And then you just keep listening. And then what happens is that you're not going to be disappointed in the same way as you might have been going into it, just like having the all music review tacked onto in your head. It's more about finding out what ties it, what makes it like the stuff that you liked at the beginning.
You guys say something in, like, it might be the trailer, like I might have gone back to the very first trailer or whatever, or it was in some episode. I kind of jumped around, but like the Bob Dylan that Timothy Chalamet is about to play is not the Bob Dylan that exists now, and is not the Bob Dylan that's exists for literal decades. And I mean, I've listened to more Bob Dylan than just that, but like there are dozens or hundreds of artists who are essentially 3 albums for me, and they've made 14 more that I have not listened to. It's just the fucking truth.
Exactly. And I mean, and Bob is like, you say 14 more, Bob is like 40,
I know.
40 more. So he's maybe the most extraordinary example of something like that. But I mean, so many of the legends that people are interested in and that make up, the quote unquote canon of rock music, it really is 2-3 records, and they're kind of crystallized at a moment in time in the general public consciousness. But Bob Dylan is about to be an 83-year-old man who has been working endlessly for the better part of a century, literally over half a century as a working artist. And so just restricting your focus to Blonde on Blonde, Blood on the Tracks, and Freewheelin', as great as those records are, is if you're legit interested in the artist, as an individual artist, as opposed to just like a symbol of something else. That's a profoundly unrewarding way of interacting with their music, to me.
When I made the Jackson Browne one, I did it because of the first 5 albums. I was like, oh, these first 5 albums are some of my favorite things I've ever listened to. But I'm not just going to do that. I'm going to keep going. And the act of doing it, which I know for a fact you guys have experienced, the act of doing it, like I can remember this one vivid moment of hearing this song Lawless Avenues, like from 1987 album called the Lives in the Balance, while I was like drinking a beer and like fucking with a lawnmower or something. And it's about like Reagan era, like Iran Contra, like inner city. The level of whatever thing clicked for me in that moment, like it hit a pleasure center that believe me, I've had a lot of like enjoyable or sad or happy or whatever moments with Jackson Browne, but it was like that was new. Like I didn't even know that new things were there for me to find in this, and is amazing.
That's it, man.
That's what why it's called Jokermen is because I think that song Jokerman was that moment, at least for me. It was like, oh my God, like what have I been missing? Or like I had no idea that late in the game, which laughably not late actually.
Those are early days.
1983.
That's a good point.
He was still doing stuff that would surprise me. But I think that the thing that comes to mind these days is like having, gone through a kind of ironic version of the show that just kind of like worked itself, washed out of the show pretty soon. Even halfway through the Dylan stuff, we were finding ourselves disagreeing with what we said like a few months before. That went away. And at this point, a more serious idea for me is that if you appreciate the work of an artist, you're kind of showing your ass if you aren't interested in what they have to say about aging, or you're not interested in what they have to say about things that can only happen to you once you've gone through more life. You look at like Leonard Cohen's final records, it's kind of like, wow, we don't know what Bob Dylan's final records are. I hope we don't. But if you were just to show somebody Rough and Rowdy Ways, like before it came out, like 30, 40 years before, there's no way that you'd want to miss that. So like,
yeah,
don't be the one who gave up and like tried to short your stock on an artist just because they had a stretch that you didn't quite like. Like they'll surprise you more often than not.
Rough and Rowdy Ways is the perfect example of that, one of the great albums of Bob Dylan's career. But even earlier on, like I vividly remember, Evan mentioned AllMusic a few minutes ago, vividly remember, using AllMusic as my go-to like Bible for the study of all this shit when I was a kid. And the Budokan record, the Bob Dylan live Budokan record, I think has like a 1.5 star rating on AllMusic, maybe 2 stars max. And I just never listened to it. I would go through the big list with all the stars and be like, oh, that one has a terrible rating. I read the review. It says it sounds like shit. That's something I'm not interested in listening to. And I literally didn't really listen to it until we got to the fucking record in the original run of Jokermen, and my mind was just blown. It is one of the most joyous, unexpected, exciting reinventions of all of this music that I can imagine. So insanely rewarding, and it had just been sitting there for as long as I had been alive, and left completely untouched, ignored by foolish old me because of some, Jamoke's 2-star review on AllMusic that he dashed off 10 years ago. And that's about the extent of the coverage of Budokan that existed. Since then they put out like that big box set last fall, so it's kind of emerged back into the public consciousness a little bit more. But even Bob Dylan records are serially and severely undercovered at certain points. And so I really do feel like it's more rewarding to just put the time in, because it might not end up satisfying you, but odds are it's going to.
What's the sort of inception moment of A, the podcast, and B, Jokermen, the title of the podcast?
I mean, that was an idea that I had, and I had the idea for the name of the show, and I just kind of had this, and I put it away, and then I don't think it was until certain things just actually aligned, like the pandemic happened, and there was all this extra time, and then Ian and I just organically started talking about it. Like, I didn't have that many other people to talk to who were as interested.
I bet you didn't. I
don't think anybody but Ian was as interested. So that was like, it was an idea that was pretty much like formed. Just that would be funny if there was a show about the late Dylan stuff. And it wasn't until we just kind of naturally started speaking about it that I realized it could work, because I didn't know who I would do it with or how it would go or whatever. And then, Ian made it possible in so many ways. I
remember when we were texting about it, we were trying to figure out like the angle on it, because there are other Bob Dylan podcasts out there, and there are more that have opened and launched in the day since we started. And I was concerned about like what is our fucking contribution to this corpus? Us just complete oafs. But I think the focus on the late era underappreciated stuff is what initially differentiated it. And wouldn't you know, it took us 2 years to get through the Bob stuff. But that same kind of approach, the mindset, to steal the parlance there, is just as rewarding to apply to and take your pick, any other artists, Lou Reed, John Cale, now the Beach Boys, obviously. We've done the Steely Dan stuff. Van Morrison has popped up, Warren Zevon, speaking of Jackson Browne. It ended up accidentally being kind of a much bigger idea than either one of us knew or suspected it to be, I think. But, going into it through Bob Dylan, I think was the perfect way to ultimately make that realization.
There's a feeling like, okay, if Bob Dylan, like maybe the household name in music that's not top 40 music, if he has music that people don't give any time or credit to, it just didn't make sense. Like, he had a career renaissance. So why was there still all of this stuff in the middle that people didn't just were like, oh, well, that's trash, as if it didn't come from the same person? It just seemed like something's missing here. And I think that the oafishness, like the kind of idiot approach that we had,
still have.
But, well,
like, are you talking about the like sort of irony part of it?
No. I think that actually the thing that makes it work is that it's not ironic as much as it is just kind of like empty-headed. Just walking in to a record and being like, well, what does this record do? How does it feel to listen to this? And there's a big difference there than, being like walking in and being like, we're going to have a lot to riff on here. Like, there's a part of it that's that, but the thing that keeps it from feeling, I think, small and cynical is that there's more of like a positive idiocy. Like, I don't expect anything, but it's like the people who went to see Bob Dylan when he was a born again Christian, and they were like, it's Bob Dylan, of course I'm going to the show. Like, that's the attitude I think we want to bring into it.
It's a good point. Yeah, it seems actually insane to be like, this person who even people who don't like him would probably acknowledge, like, sort of creative genius, massively important. Like, yep, that same guy. Oh, he made an album in 1983. I'm all set. But I do that all the time.
Yeah. Well, here you are with Jackson Browne doing the same. And that's one thing that makes all these things, all these artists, that links them all, is that they didn't quit. They didn't retire. And so I don't think we would ever cover a band that retired. I don't think we have talked about a band that retired.
Well, Steely Dan retired as a band, although Don and Walt obviously have continued to make music, or continued, they kept touring, in Walter's case, to make music into their late era.
Yeah, they didn't just hang up the music thing. They're not like Gene Simmons. These are people who just kept doing it in some form.
Yeah. Your take on things is interesting to me, Justin, because everything that we've done on Jokermen has been like in a very similar kind of register, I would say, or not similar register maybe, but like it makes sense that like Bob Dylan fans would be Lou Reed fans and would also be Beach Boys fans and Steely Dan fans and so on. But with your show, like doing Jackson Browne and Conor Oberst and Against Me, that's like to me, that seems like much more kind of dissimilar areas of focus than the stuff that we have targeted so far.
It's probably stupid and self-sabotaging, except for everything except my soul. But in reality, though, like I did see a sort of like earnestness, wonderkin songwriting commonality in like Jackson Browne to Bright Eyes, and then I did see a sort of like DIY punk adjacent folk music transition to Against Me that I like might have concocted on my own, but like worked, I think, in a way. I will say you guys have like sort of done a good job of making you do whatever the fuck you want from the start of it. Like the descriptions are quick, and I think my first whole process was a little bit overthought and like over careful and good. I'm really, really proud of it. But it was just me like deep inside like Facebook groups full of baby boomers and stuff. And I will say I don't want to say any of that derisively really at all, but I do know that I felt like I needed to pop out of it for a little bit.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
That explains a little bit of that. But I will say that sure, those are different, but you guys jump around in a way that seems like you're not overthinking that structure too much. Like you'll have little episodes pop up in the middle of a long series you're going, and you're just kind of we're doing all these things. Like this is what we're doing.
Yeah. I think since we wrapped the Bob stuff, we've done a good job of kind of naturally branching out and willingly following our interests wherever they may lead us. Because at this point, I think we both kind of just trust the process, so to speak, and assume that, what we're going to be interested in and what listeners are going to be interested in. Like if we're interested in it, it's going to make for good, discussion, and the listeners are going to be interested in it. Whether it's like Girls for me, whether it's Scott Walker for Evan, whether it's David Berman and Silver Jews, for both of us at this point. None of those acts are necessarily like directly linked to Bob Dylan, besides the fact that Bob Dylan has basically influenced every person working in the rock music medium, ever. I think that giving ourselves a license to sort of expand and move beyond just these narrow purviews has definitely made for a more rewarding experience.
It shows in the show, and it's like the thing you just described about making the show is the same thing you'd want in an artist as they turn 30 and 40 and 50 and 60. It's like,
sure.
Well, you're going to be in a different place. Just be in that place that you're at. Like,
that's like the highest compliment you could give us. So thank you. I mean, I think that that's the point of the show, and it's very hard to even address without sounding like a patting oneself on the back, like super hard. But I do think that there's something to the idea of the better way to put it, rather than being like a critic who is totally apart from the way an artist works, is that the truth is that we found artists like to talk about this stuff too. Like the subjects that we talk about are typically artists that other artists can't realistically say they don't look up to. They do. Like there are a few that are just still in this like sort of rarefied zone of like, even your favorite artists working right now, they're probably not going to be like, oh, they're overrated. Talking about like Bob Dylan. I mean, a few like young upstarts will come out and say stuff
someone
like that.
Did recently, right? Someone did. Yeah.
There's always somebody who does. But the idea of approaching criticism, it's like, I feel like the criticism or the role of a critic or whatever we are, there is a relationship that exists between that and the artists working. And they're not the same thing, but they have parallels. They do kind of work well together when a certain kind of approach is there for both. Like there's a need for people to be seriously engaging, open-mindedly engaging with art. If you don't have that and you don't engage the artists who are working in that way, you're kind of not helping the ecosystem of things. Like how distressing or discouraging is it for an artist to never find themselves talking about what actually inspires them in other art by doing that kind of just amongst ourselves and then doing it with other artists. It does something positive to kind of create a more fruitful environment. It's like, okay, like there's a chance people are going to actually feel something with what I make.
I think it probably lights them up a lot more than just asking them like, so what was the process of the recording the blah, blah, blah and your last yada, yada?
Exactly. Yeah. Like when we were doing the Velvet stuff, there was a new Yo La Tengo record that came out, This Stupid World, great record from last year. And we were lucky enough to get Ira on the show to talk during that press cycle, right? When he was presumably doing just interviews with, every music mag and NPR radio and stuff like that. But we got, when we got him on the show, we got to talk about a Velvet Underground bootleg that sounded like dog shit. That neither one of us had ever listened to, but was a great record because, it was one of Ira's favorite Velvet Underground bootlegs. And like that, to me, as like a fan of Yo La Tengo, right? I'm so much more interested to hear that conversation with him than I would be to, have some mealy-mouthed journalist be like, so what are your influences on this record?
Yeah, no, that's
whatever,
that's like the real actual seeds of what becomes that artist and that band. And
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, you look at what Bob Dylan did with his book, The Philosophy of Modern Song, and it's like Bob Dylan wrote a whole book's worth of just soliloquizing and weird flights of fancy where he's talking about other people's music.
Yeah, that's a
And
great.
you can't get him to open up at all about his own music.
Yeah.
I mean, not really. But when you read that book, our takeaway was, actually being like, oh my God, he seems to very much be talking about himself here. But he's like talking about blue suede shoes. He has like an alibi. And I think artists sometimes work that way, where it's like they don't want to talk about themselves, but if it's sort of displaced, suddenly you're talking about whatever.
That's a great point. That's exactly what all of us are doing all the time. Like, I think about it. It's like, oh, I'm making a podcast that's jumping from between 12 Bright Eyes records. All I'm actually talking about and all of that is where I was when I was 21 and we were like going to Iraq and whatever. That's all. And that's how they're experiencing it too. That Bob Dylan book, my dad has it, and I was down there about a month and a half ago, and I like grabbed the book, opened it up, saw that there was a Jackson Browne page on it. Like, oh, I need to read that.
Yeah,
and I
did
left
the Pretender, right?
Yeah, and I left it. I left it like dog-eared at my parents' house without ever reading it, and it's driving me crazy.
Oh, it's real good.
I'm gonna. Nice.
I just got it sitting next to me at all times.
All right, you want to give us a reading? No,
I don't need to. I can if you want.
I know I could find it online, but I'm saving it for when I go back down to California in a month.
This book is ridiculous.
It's great.
It's Tutti Frutti, Little Richer.
But there's so many people who went after that book, being like, "Well, this isn't really about his philosophy of modern song." It's like, first of all, shut up.
Good.
Second of all, it's like that's kind of what a podcast is too, and maybe you're just not like, oh, well, it's in the shape of a book, so it should be more serious. Like, what are you talking about? It's you can't be complaining about like, oh, the starry state of music journalism and criticism, and then also turning up your nose at every time it comes to you in a different form.
Yeah,
and I think that's kind of like where podcasts, among other things, come in, is like, okay, maybe you don't recognize this as the shitty, turgid music criticism that you're used to, but maybe that doesn't mean it's not music criticism. Maybe it's just something, a form of it that's a little bit less
beauty
up its own ass.
Precious.
I hope.
Bob Dylan does what Bob Dylan wants, whether it's music or it's that, right? And we're lucky for that. I think you're right that podcast, like your podcasts, and I just hope that the one I'm making is doing something.
Yeah, you can't really take any lesson from Bob Dylan. You can't do I'm gonna be like Bob Dylan. The one thing I think you can take away is just, I'm gonna not apologize as much to myself. I'm gonna just let this move forward. I'm gonna keep evolving and allow that maybe you're wrong this time and maybe you'll be right next time. That's more of like the lesson you can get from him. I wouldn't recommend trying to be like him, though.
That's a good point. Would you, so Ben Lee, the musician, I'd read the LA Times article and then heard about the podcast and like dabbled into it, and then he talked about it on a podcast episode about Against Me in this sort of like full culmination of their like sellout arc, like a lot of fans mad at them for a record and everything like that. And he brought up specifically your podcast, and he didn't say Jokermen Mindset, but he talked about like, he was even talking about it was like, it's less about just the one thing you make, just make things in a way that you make them over a long period of time and let that be what you're doing. He said it in a way that like really compelled me to like write it on the sticky note in front of me, really go to it. And I've since bombed in,
Sure.
And and I think he's probably a type of person that just does what he wants and goes where he goes, and crowds come and go with him as he goes. You've done things about Brian Wilson, Lou Reed, Bob Dylan. These are like sort of really bending forward kind of genius type people in their different ways and in their different worlds and everything like that. Like, to push back against this mindset, and I don't say push back against this mindset because I think it's a good aspirational one you have. Like, it's artistic optimism about the idea that the best can be ahead is beautiful, but also it is also true that some artists just make less interesting, worse versions of the thing they made before, right?
Sure,
that
sure.
does. There are some that aren't doing, like when they make their modern song book in their 70s, it is cookie
grab.
cutter. it is cookie cutter. It is that, like, that is also existing, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, I was saying it in the context of like, yes, that's true. Like you are right that most of the time it's not that way. But if you do know that it can happen, then it's one of these things that changes everything. Like
Yeah.
if you have, it's like religious faith. It's like, it doesn't matter that everything is bad if you know that a miracle can occur. That must change your way of thinking about how
Yeah.
things work. And there are these art miracles, these people who just like pull something off that is so unbelievable and like just impossible. Yeah, for everybody who just does it like in this kind of sad by the numbers way, there's somebody who turned water into wine musically or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, there always can be artistic miracles, certainly, but you know, I feel like I've got sort of a pretty solid, you know, shit detector at this point, and
Yeah.
it's a little bit like, you know, the famous pornography definition. Like, I can't write it down, but I know it when I see it. Like, I like pointing at Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, Brian Wilson, as dissimilar as their music may be, you know, at certain points. Like, I know it when I know these guys have got it. Versus, you know, I'm not going to, you know, rag on anyone in particular, but, you know, I can tell when someone is not of that kind of caliber, of that ilk. And that just, and that doesn't even necessarily make it music that I'm not interested in listening to. You know, Lord knows I've listened to plenty of records by bands that just put out a couple good ones and then they fade away into the night and are not anything in particular, or not anything, you know, particularly exciting or new or revolutionary. But that would not be the kind of thing I think that we would choose to really, you know, devote our fucking time and minds to the way that we do on this show.
Yeah, like the Jerry Seinfeld movie. I was just like hearing people talk about this, like that he made this Pop-Tarts movie, and it's like this long-standing idea he's had to make this movie about Pop-Tarts. And the whole idea is just dumb and pretty cynical and stupid. It's just like, well, what if there was a biopic type origin story movie but it was about something dumb and unimportant? It's like, you know what happens when you make that? Like exactly what you'd expect.
In Seinfeld's case, it's best to pretend that he passed away at an early age immediately following the Seinfeld finale.
Yeah, that would have been better creatively for him. But like I think I described it as artistic optimism in that, like, just not to shut off as much as you want to keep like a bullshit detector alive and armed. There's as much importance in like not shutting off the radar for like, oh, is this the real thing this time? It's like, why would you? That's just actually kind of sad, is if you stop even looking for.
The whole spirit of it is have your mind open to it. Don't close off to it. I've closed off to it probably most of my life. And I close off to it for a reason as idiotic as like, oh no, those Jackson Browne albums in the 80s just sing about politics in some way that I find maybe corny or something like that. But I hadn't even listened. I hadn't even scrutinized. It's like, that's literally what that person was thinking about. And also those records are a fraction as popular. They're not, he knows that, all of that. And so whatever they are, they are actually honest to what that person was doing. And every album, what you can say about all of them is that someone made them. Someone took the time to turn them from nothing into something. And I can guarantee you there's something to enjoy in that. And when you do something like Lou Reed collaborating with Metallica or something like that, you definitely, whether that's good or bad or somewhere in the middle, it ain't just dismissible. There's a thing there.
There was a lot of time and effort and energy and emotional effort, applied to that. And you can certainly be dismissive and say like, oh, this fucking sucks. Who likes this shit? But like, to be so flippant, I think, does the artist a disservice, certainly, and does yourself a disservice, because again, you're only cheating yourself in that case. We can go out there and enjoy Lulu as much as we like here ourselves, and know that anyone who's just waving it away with the flip their wrist, that's their loss. It really is a better. Like I said, I'm more engaged with like music than I ever have been, I think, at this point, really due to this this newer, more exciting way of approaching records. There was a extended period of time for a couple of years there before the pandemic and before we started this that like I just didn't really listen to music much at all. Like I didn't really listen to new records. I'd listened to all the Bob Dylan records I wanted to listen to, and it was like, what else is there for me to listen to at this point? And obviously I've seen the error of my ways since then.
Are you guys early 30s?
I am early 30s. Evan is late 20s.
Well, yeah, I'm almost 30. I'll be 30 in November.
He's the Zoomer of the podcast.
Well, I'm actually the young millennial. I'm the cut right before that cutoff. Youngest millennial.
I'm old millennial. I'm old millennial. Born the same year this came out. That I found out.
Hell yeah, I'm 92.
Wow.
So
as infidels,
83 is a good year for this is a thing we've seen in the Bob Dylan world. Actually, is what Bob Dylan release came out the year you were born. So 83 with infidels, a lot better to be born in 83 than 85 or 86. I'll tell you that.
Oh man, nice.
Well, to most people. Just getting back to what we were just saying earlier, a second ago, is like it's kind of like crazy to me, this self-satisfied stance that has kind of existed and in many ways continues to exist, where it's like I'm sitting here and I get to just consume what the artist makes and decide whether it's good or bad, just like put my thumb up or down.
Yeah.
And then the artist gets punished or the artist gets praised. And it's like, you're the consumer. The least you can do is consume with some kind of a spirit of an actual appetite, some kind of like vim and vigor. Like, why are you just like sitting there being like, you're making something that could be active into something that is passive and petulant and like just sucks. Like you're making this into a thing where it's just like turning stuff away that comes to your table instead of engaging with it. You're deleting most of what could be a very engaging activity from your repertoire. And that's kind of what we've found is like, this is a whole activity. It's a whole all-consuming discipline to use that extremely lightly. But
do you find that in life outside of podcast, you are easily optimistic or prone to like sardonic criticism, and that this is like a good direction to bend yourself, but like a healthy practice? Not to become that kind of question,
but I think generally it's helped me be more open-minded and optimistic. I tend to be optimistic, but I also think that it's important not to just be like fully open-minded. One thing that comes up on the show a lot is like when an artist has a problem with another artist, I don't think that's a bad thing. For example, like it shows that they have a point of view. At least Steve Albini, the late great Steve Albini, was infamous amongst Steely Dan fans anyway for having this beef with Steely Dan. And I think the takeaway from that, for example, is like, if you like that guy, if you love Steve Albini, you know that what he had a problem with was he perceived, erroneous or not, that some self-satisfied music was being praised, and he didn't like that. If you give the benefit of the doubt, like, it's possible to be a snob and to be kind of like optimistic at the same time.
I was always with Albini on that because, I mean, I could learn to love Steely Dan too, and I like some, but the last 10 years have been a real swell of massive love for Steely Dan that needed a correcting force to it, and good on Steve Albini for being that.
Everyone's allowed to be wrong.
Yeah, he was wrong in like a noble way. Like I think that he really meant, he thought it was bad in a certain way that like was also the reason he made so much good stuff.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
All right, here's a question. I just went camping for a couple days out here in Pacific Northwest, and like a group of Canadian bros that were like maybe 20 were on like a bachelor party. I'm out like sitting, and these like 7-8 dudes kind of end up on like a cliffside, and they start singing together. These are like 20-year-old Canadian kind of like good time party guys, and they're singing a Bob Dylan song.
Really?
What Bob Dylan song we think they're singing?
Wow. Did this? They actually were singing a Bob Dylan song?
This happened. I just wanted to like put my pulse on like what's resonating with that group of guys. And I talked to them a little after, and they were nice guys. They just were good time dudes.
A song
what song
just sing off on a mountaintop
for 20-year-old Canadian guys on a bachelor party to be singing? I'm going Jokerman. That's got to be it.
God, I'd love it.
I wish. I hope.
Okay.
It's wrong. It's wrong.
Joey, excuse me. Shake, shake, mama.
What would you sing out to the ocean?
I mean, I wouldn't overthink it with these guys. They just knew the song probably.
I don't know. It can't be Hurricane. There's too many lyrics.
They did the hard R in Hurricane uncensored.
I don't know. I really couldn't even begin to guess.
It was Don't Think Twice, That's All Right, which like in certain times in my life, I think might be like, I don't know what I would say is like the sort of like culturally biggest Bob Dylan song. Is it like Times They Are Changing but I don't know. I just remember being like, this moment's making me happy.
Wow.
This is like funny to watch these guys. And that's got plenty of words too.
That's fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's an immortal song for sure.
It is. I'm looking at the Spotify. You know, it's take it with a grain of salt with the Spotify top tracks, but Don't Think Twice is the number 7 most popular Bob Dylan song on there.
Is it having a TikTok moment or something?
I think. I mean, the Bob Dylan. What is it? Bob Dylan core on TikTok is definitely a thing, and I'm sure that's only become more of a thing with the Timmy Chalamet set pictures that have been emerging. So.
We got to save TikTok from this TikTok ban, if only just to preserve the rock music of the 20th century.
I know. I'm gonna just keep talking about my camping trip right now.
Sure.
I picked up like the Sunday New York Times on this trip, which I don't grab a printed newspaper very often. And I was like, I'm just gonna like over these 2-3 days read some of this. And there was a whole section about TikTok ban and all this, so I read a lot of that. So it reminded me of that. But there was a thing on there, and I knew I was going to be doing this interview the day I got back, but a really, really good article about the idea of mid-TV, like mid-TV. And I was offline the last couple of days. I don't know if this has like gone around, but it should. And what it was like, it was talking about the idea of like TV being good now in a way that doesn't afford itself the ability to be great or bad in a way that's interesting. Like the people who made Game of Thrones are now making some other dragon show that looks like even glossier and has the sheen of something even better. Almost every show looks that way on like your flat screen TV now, but also needs to do the job of being fine and have a chance to be like a ubiquitous hit in some way, which like kind of reminds me of like, that's kind of the like bullshit detector you were talking about earlier, the sort of like, are there layers below this that I can get to and decide to find interesting? Or did someone just know how to make the thing that's going to work and look shiny in the right way? The same way like the decor in like an Airbnb would look or something like that.
Totally. Yeah. There's
definitely
a glossy sheen to everything, you know, in the world, whether it's the Airbnb decor, the television programs, or the music that's being made. And, you know, there are still good, like, you know, TV is interesting. There are good programs that come out, certainly. But in general, everything has just got, especially the streaming shows, you know, just have this kind of like this flavor to it, and it like maybe it's the bullshit detector for me on that. Like I can't really describe it or anything, but like you can tell what a Netflix TV show is, you know, or a Hulu TV show, and it's just qualitatively, fundamentally made out of different component parts than The Sopranos or Mad Men or you know Seinfeld or Curb Your Enthusiasm or whatever.
Yeah, the art directors department, or the art directors guild rather, today announced like that their training program is closing because they can't in earnest recommend anybody attempt to do this profession because it's so hopeless now. Like there's just people aren't being hired. There's not teams of set dressers. A whole part of what used to exist in movies and television that were like the kind of creative backbone for the shows and the programs and the movies, the stuff that actually populates and like gives life to a show. And so I think what we see now with a lot of media is like just this sort of skeleton with nothing behind its eyes, and it's because there is no value being placed on the side of it that is just about the details and about embellishing and making something feel textured. And so when it comes to TV and like movies and music, you kind of do have to, I think, rely on like auteurism and just be like, you follow the people who you know that there's some kind of guiding visionary there, that one person whose job it is to just have come up with the show. Now it's kind of up to them to make the entire thing feel like that they are the art director department now. It's like,
that's a good point. Maybe this will work, maybe it won't, but at least it's coming. It's someone's pure expression of themselves in a way. And yeah, they talk about like examples of good things. Obviously there's a lot of good things where I think they talk about The Curse, like the Nathan Fielder shows.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
like,
but there you go.
show.
Those are like really
Good.
smart, really
Good.
visionary directors.
Gonna make you happy, gonna make you uncomfortable, gonna make you mad, gonna do all that. And I
They're
think
going to elicit something from you, exactly, instead of
Gonna
letting it
elicit-
just literally wash over you
Yeah.
like a a stiff breeze and then completely pass you by.
and I
Some
think
of
what
that's
is
good though, like the Columbo, like that can be good.
But that's old.
There's-
That's old.
there's
Like the
room-
new. If there's a new version of Columbo, it's gonna be dog shit. But the old Columbo is still there. There's an artistry to that, even though it had this kind of disposable, casual quality to it at the same time. Same thing
Well,
with like
it's-
X-Files,
With
which
that
I
as
love.
Peter Falk in that seat of like the focal point. X-Files also, where I just have to make as long as we're talking about TV, Kolchak the Night Stalker. There's only 20 episodes. Great show. One of the first shows that David Chase wrote for.
nice.
Interesting.
It's an excellent. It's basically the X-Files, but with the dad from A Christmas Story, Darren McGavin, as a like annoying photojournalist guy, and there's a Monster of the Week. That's just a
Nice.
great piece. That's 20 episodes of great television.
What this was getting at was like, obviously this is not some snobbery about like there's no place for things that are just things to kick back and watch and allow to be either fun or even easy to a certain degree. But I think what it was getting at is that like we've arrived at a place where that thing can be packaged in the sheen of the big important thing and make you feel like that's what it is. And so everything can feel that way now, even though you're like,
The bar has been lowered.
it's
overall.
not that. Yeah, it's not
It's
that.
just-
And to bring it to music, like I thought about it. I did a podcast, like a 10 episode thing about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, my friend Ryan during pandemic, that was just like 64 to 74, comparing them each year. And you watch them go through. It's a fucking really fun journey to take. I thought a lot about like what you guys do with the Beach Boys and like the pumped in crowd sounds and stuff like that.
Sure.
A lot of that. So that ends, and we did one episode that just kind of telegraphed forward to like all the stuff that happens in the late 70s, 80s, 90s. It was one episode. It was very non-Jokermen mindset, to be honest with you. But it was very clear there is a lot of interesting stuff that happens in there, especially with the Rolling Stones. And anyway, the Rolling Stones album that came out this last year is like, to me, feels like it's like using a term of like return to form. You're going to feel like you're listening to Sticky Fingers, and the imagery is going to look like that. And it felt like trickery from a marketing department or something.
It's an interesting. We actually did an episode about that record on our other Bob pod with Hyden, just like a bonus episode. And I think we all kind of agreed that we actually liked it more than we expected to. It definitely does have sort of like an empty calories diet soda type feel to it. But even with that, and even with that weird, like glossy fucking producer guy they brought in to, auto-tune Mick Jagger to hell, it is still Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and Ron Wood at the end of the day.
Don't be angry with me.
Yeah, so like it can't help but kind of shine through even all of the schlock and bullshit that has been plastered onto the surface.
Yeah.
I fully agree. I think the Rolling Stones album is exactly as enjoyable as you described, but exactly in the same way as the mid TV conversation we just had. That's where I land on it. Stephen Hyden it came on the third episode of the Jackson Browne podcast I made, which is about the kindest thing, because the thing wasn't out yet. So for him to say yes to that was very nice. And he was so good and so nice. And he'd written a thing about a Jackson Browne the song "Late for the Sky" comes up in a very
I love
iconic scene. And
that song, by the way. So great.
amazing song. And it comes up. He wrote a really good AV piece, AV Club piece about the scene in Taxi Driver where that song plays.
Sure.
And I think that's why he came on, but he was so good. And I remember a moment in it because I hadn't run any yet. And you guys talked about like the starting of it. And I remember him like very kindly saying like, are you gonna edit this? I was like, I am gonna edit this. And I edited it, and just very nice, very, very nice and cool of him. I remember that being like a this is gonna work moment. Like it was me and my friends and my cousins and stuff recording before that. And it was like it was a cool moment.
We had a couple of those moments early on in our run too. But you know, it's there's you get by with a little help from your friends to quote another band that we all like. There's good people out there. They're willing to just get on and rap with you and have a good time.
As long as we're talking about Jackson Browne, though, that's the one record I know. And I just want to say, Fountains of Sorrow, is that the name of the song?
Fountain of Sorrow, yeah.
Fountain of Sorrow. So great. That song is like an epic.
It's amazing.
The first time I heard that, granted, I was like freshly broken up with at the time. I'm much happier now, but like I didn't know what I was getting into, so it was like brutal, but in the best way. Like that's solid gold.
You know when they revamped Gawker and then Gawker died again?
Yeah.
You watched that happen. But there was a writer on that named Claire Carasillo. And one time I got back from some friend's house and I'd probably had like, I drank a little bit and I just like, I'm just going to like habitually type the word Gawker into the internet. And the top line homepage story on Gawker was like finding melancholy in the YouTube comments of Jackson Browne's Fountain of Sorrow. Like the kind of thing that I was like, who pranked my computer screen? Like, why would this possibly be the homepage story of this website right now? And I read that and it was really funny and really good. And I really identified it in a way that I was talking about, like being in all those I was in like Facebook groups to post these articles because there were like 40,000 Jackson Browne and Eagles fans or whatever in these groups.
Right.
And she became the guest on like one of the Bright Eyes episodes and stuff.
That's great.
Fun story. That song's amazing. And that album starts with 2 songs that are like 6-7 minutes long. Just a real confident sort of like lean all the way into your shit in the exact moment that you should in your career kind of thing.
For sure.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into Jackson Browne and Zevon. I mean, it's crazy how much like Jackson Browne is like the White Lodge version of Zevon, and they have this like weird, he's like the PG-13 version at times. He's like Sonic and Zevon is Knuckles or Shadow.
It's great because it creates the situation where the first 2 albums are the 2 Zevon albums that are a lot like those classic Bob Dylan's one you talk about, and then Warren Zevon goes Zevon mode later after that. But I think that like Jackson Browne's in that book saying like, let's hold on to Werewolves in London for the second one so that you're this fucking genius on this first one. And it's just that there's a lot of smart stuff, but I listened today to you guys talking about the Nico record, Chelsea Girl. And one of you talked about the line, "Don't confront me with my failures, I've not forgotten them." And like kind of talks about it as like sounding maybe a little detached and ho-hum and whatever. But then if you really step back on it, that's just a person like living deep in their shit. There's this thing there, and really liked it. Really liking the Beach Boys stuff. Speaking of like kind of like just doing what you want to do and not overthinking it, talking about different root beers for 7 to 10 to 15 minutes at the beginning of each episode.
We'll see how long we can keep that joke running.
Living embodiment of that. So good on it. Thanks so much for coming on it. Love to talk to you guys again sometime way down the line. I think there's like a fun, slightly parallel thing we're doing.
Oh, definitely.
Where can people find Jokermen and you guys?
Follow us on Instagram and on x.com. Joker at Jokerman Podcast on both. We got a Patreon. Hop on there and sub if you want to, or otherwise just look us up on the old Apple Podcasts or Spotify platforms. There's plenty of freely available material out there for all the cheapskates.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Justin. This was a real treat. We always get, we appreciate the opportunity to prattle on about ourselves instead of prattling on about our art heroes for an hour.
Good.
When did you start doing the podcast, by the way? When did you begin doing it?
Like in November before the pandemic, I had like a time when I was like in my bedroom and smoked some weed or or a gummy or something like that, and was like down a Wikipedia hole of Jackson. Like I was in like, I'd go 5 years without listening to Jackson Browne. And I was listening one night and I realized like I thought his first five records were all spent through the 70s like equally. I had the realization that like, oh no, 72, 73, 74, all his first three albums came out 3 years in a row. And that's like with Fountain of Sorrow, all that, with These Days and Take It Easy and all the just it's crazy. It's a crazy thing. And I remember just being sort of like seized by that moment. And my wife came in and she likes Jackson Browne, she likes all this, but sort of the moment where it's like this moment is for me, and she came in, I was like, Bianca, these albums came out in 3 fucking years. It's crazy. And you could tell she's like sort of like, I'm happy for the way you're experiencing this moment, but like,
oh, I know this.
That's your thing, dude.
Yeah, how about that? And I remember that stayed with me. And then I was like, what if I just did a thing about like those first five albums? What if I just did a thing about each of them? And I recorded interviews with 3 or 4 people. One of them, that Stephen Hyden one, I sat on for 3 or 4 months, and then the pandemic happened that March, and then I did more, and then I did them weekly until that one ended, and then took a break, and then did the other ones.
Well, it's definitely another great part of the new ecosystem of notallmusic.com. So
yes,
thank you for your service.
Thank you guys both for doing it.